Fine with me.
Okay. I wanted to start with a story. I had a student when I worked at Columbia, this is going back decades. I had a student who came to me a few months after her grandmother had passed away. Her grandmother was the matriarch of was a very traditional Sephardic family, and she was the matriarch of the family. Everyone, you know, basically the way she described it, it was like the godfather, the godmother, in a sense, that everyone came to her, asked, like, if the first person you introduced your boyfriend or girlfriend to was the grandmother, the first person you talked to about your life plans was the grandmother. And she was a constant presence in everyone's life. um Her granddaughter was at Columbia University, brilliant. I haven't been in touch with her in a couple of years, but the last that I heard, she was as successful as I could possibly imagine. You know, she was in political science. She went to law school. Very successful young woman. She came to my office to talk about an experience that she had. She said, "Rabbi, I do not believe in life after death in this quite, but I went to my grandmother's house. I sat down in her room and she sat down next to me. This is after she died. She says, my grandmother sat down next to me and had a conversation with me. And she's like, I know, am I crazy? I'm like, I just said, just keep talking, keep saying. She said, my grandmother sat down. She said that she's very proud of me and that she sees me as someone who can help take on her role, that the family needs guidance, and that she really thinks that this young woman is will be able to take on that role. And she said, am I crazy? Like, what's going on? I said, well, you don't look crazy, because she didn't. She wasn't acting crazy. And I start just to ask her, well, how does it feel? And I like, and what do you think? Do you think it's fair that your grandmother asked you this? Do you think that that's something, do you think that's something you want to do? We had this long conversation, and I didn't focus on whether it was real or not. And to me, and that's why the second half of this, of does it matter, you know, what happens afterwards? In that moment, I actually don't think it mattered. And that's, but it led to a larger conversation. After we had the pastoral about her own life, and she was able to express what she wanted, she was actually then interested. Well, what do you think psychologically is happening? Now, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not an expert in these things, but I had an idea that I wanted to share. But before I get to that, has anyone had an experience like that where they've been, Arlene talked about, you talked about like the sense that there are spirits everywhere. And I'll tell you, when I pray, when I lead services, I often lead services on my father's yurt site. Um, you know, this year we'll see, and Anshe Emet, because my father's yurt site is the seventh day of Passover. So, and we do have services the eighth. So, I got to figure it out. But I usually, there's a custom of leading services on a yurt site for a parent. So, and year after year, my father is there standing with me. Is he really? Am I crazy? I'm like, I don't think I'm crazy. I don't actually know. I wouldn't actually say that I perceive him in a direct way, but I feel like his presence is there. Um, so has anyone experienced that or anything like it, or knows people who have?
Maybe not within the realm of a deceased person per se, but we know so little about how our brains work, and we know so little about the input that comes in, the memories that get kicked around, our ability to talk to people who aren't necessarily there. And to answer your question, are we crazy? Hell yeah, we're all crazy. But nobody knows what it is anyway, so it doesn't matter.
I really like the way to reorient it. It's not about, it's not like there's a goal of not being crazy. We're all a little crazy,
Yeah.
but does it create problems? I guess is really, there are some people who, you know, when they say, yeah, well, the dead told, the dead told me to, you had the devil told me to, the devil told me to kill my family, like, or whatever it is that the serial killer would say. Like, there is a point at which you say, no, that's a little crazy, but we're all a little crazy we all have these experiences. Okay. Does anyone, anything like that?
Well, I can say that once when I was down at my daughter's, she was doing a play and I had to get there myself from her apartment because she left early or whatever. And I'd take the subways, and that's always stressful for me because I always get on and off the wrong way and everything. And I was probably feeling very much alone at that particular moment. And as I was walking to the subway, it must have been before election day, and there was a woman there handing out things, and I must have looked rather distressed because the woman avoided me, but she had a son with her. And the little kid came over to me and handed me a flyer. And I took it because he was a little kid. What could I say? Like, get out of my way. But it was for the Green Party, and it was the person that was running. I don't know if it was for governor. It was for some state office. It was a high up office. Was actually somebody that Pat worked with in Albany, and it was a woman that I knew. And I looked at this like, oh my God. And then when I was making it through the subway, when I finally got there, there was somebody playing the violin, and in the big thing was asking for money. It was either a liver transplant, a kidney transplant, or something like that. So, my husband had one. So anyway, so I at least interpreted those things like I wasn't really alone.
Right.
That it brought me comfort. Now, whether it was really my husband's spirit doing that, I have no idea. But I like to think that.
I want to ask then a follow-up question. What do you think? Ernie already gave a bit of an answer to. Does anyone have an opinion, like a strong opinion about what is going on? If it isn't, let's say it isn't, you're saying, it isn't a spirit talking. What do you think is going on? Like, why is the person seeing,
Oh, I think we see what we want to see.
see what you want to see. Definitely. Definitely. Is that?
I mean,
It could be more of a psychological manifestation. We see what we want to see, unless we're in denial.
Right.
I mean, I've gone to a medium, and I think I spoke to my grandmother, my mother's mother.
Right.
Or there were times I felt like my mother was haunting me.
Don't talk to my daughter. That's how she might be.
I think like what's interesting, a lot of times people can say, like, I think a lot of us have to deal with a mother or father who haunted us, whether in life or afterlife, and that's and you could describe it's a psychological projection. It's, maybe the young woman in the case is feeling guilty, or there's something else going on, and she's projecting it onto the world. I once heard something very interesting, that the difference between a psychologist and a mystic, like a Hasidic master, or is not. It's not. They both study the same thing. They deeply study the human experience. It's just the conclusions they draw, whether we're projecting it onto the world or whether it's actually fundamental to the way the world works. That's really just the difference between them. The psychologist says we're projecting it, and the mystic is saying, no, I'm experiencing something that's more fundamental. But in the end, you can find a lot of very interesting insights about the human experience in both psychological works and in mystical works. So, and I think that whether or not your mother's haunting you, or whether or not, like she's, at times she haunts, and that's true for my father of blessed memory definitely haunts me, both in positively standing next to me and in more negative ways. And that's between me and my therapist, right?
Correct.
But whether or not he's haunting me, whether or not in reality or it's purely a projection, in some degree it doesn't matter. I still need to deal with the fact that I have to think about my father and what he meant to me, and so I had one explanation that I wanted to share, that in that moment when I was talking to this young woman, it was 2 years after rabbinical school, and our rabbinical school. I'll say one thing about my rabbinical school is I think it did change the way rabbinical schools teach their rabbis, because it really focused on psychology, and social work, and just the pastoral element of being a rabbi, which especially for an Orthodox place, which was my background, was very rare. But it was also, JTS didn't do that all that much then either. And my school really wanted to initiate this study of psychology as part of rabbinic training. And we had a process group. Every week we sat with our cohort and with a psychologist, and we'd just talk. First year, we were all very pleasant to each other because we didn't really know each other. Second year, we began to really dislike each other and started to complain about why we had to be in process group. Third year, we hated each other, hated process group, wanted nothing to do with it. Fourth year, we started to understand it, and when we graduated, we missed it. And that seems to be the experience of pretty much every cohort that has gone through that program. It was a really intense program. The reason I bring it up is that I was always taught something in it. The psychologist would point out what happened when somebody would leave the group. He pointed one day, my role in the group was generally to be a middleman. There was one guy who was always sarcastic. There was another guy who was always very, would take offense at things. And I always felt I needed to negotiate between the two of them. The sarcastic guy, who's a rabbi in California, one day he doesn't show up. And I suddenly became the sarcastic one. I was making jokes. I was acting in ways that were completely out of character for the process group. And the psychologist pointed that out to me. He's like, why is it, do you think, that you're suddenly being sarcastic and somebody else is trying to mediate between you and the person who's normally very, morally takes umbrage at things? And he explains, like, well, that's part of the way that group dynamics work, and he gave us an analogy from family therapy, which we'd also studied, which is, if you ever had an experience where you have two kids in a family and one kid is really troubled, and you bring that kid to a psychologist or to a learning specialist, and you work with him, and that child gets much better at school, everything seems to be working out, and then suddenly the brother starts acting out. The brother who had no problems suddenly starts doing badly in school, suddenly starts having all of these issues. Anyone who works with families, knows that that's a very common phenomenon. And it's because the children, it's not actually a problem of the child, it's a problem within the family, that the children are responding to something. Maybe the parents are having troubles, there could be something else going on, and the children are, in a sense, a distraction from that. What I learned from all of that is that our feelings, even our sense of experience, is very influenced by the people around us and the various roles that people have with each other. And it hit me in my conversation with this young woman that she was experiencing that dynamic, the same thing that drove me to be sarcastic, the same thing that drives the brother to suddenly start acting out. She was experiencing that on an internal level, that she was her grandmother in this important role in her life was missing. And in the family, that role was missing. And she was experiencing within a deep psychological shock, she was experiencing that need to substitute for her grandmother. Now, is that purely psychological? Is that purely internal? Or is her grandmother haunting her? I'm not sure. It really didn't matter in that moment. The conversation that mattered was, okay, well, what if your grandmother were here saying that to you, what would you say? And what worries, and what do you think and if you, what worries do you think are pushing your grandmother, whether that's only in your head or not? Like what are the real concerns behind it? When you miss this like major family figure. And we ended up having, I think, a very meaningful conversation about it. And so I wanted to start that is, I think, when we're talking about mourning and grief, people will experience such a vastly different amount of just the most spiritual people will in that moment, they'll have nothing to say about talking to the dead. The most atheist people will have experiences of where a medium would say, yeah, your mother's haunting you, and everything in between. And the point of being there as a consoler, as somebody who has to be there to help take care of community, is to be open to that and to recognize that your job in that moment is, well, I don't really think your mother is haunting you. I mean, that's not your job, nor is your job in that moment to say, well, what would your father think? What would if that's not where they're at and that's not the experience that they're going through, if that's not the conversation that they need to have, then we let it go. So that was all I want to get to now, to the Torah learning and the remainder of this. I wanted to share some traditional rabbinic texts, not Bible texts. There isn't a lot in the Bible that certainly not in our Bible. The Christian Bible has more, but there isn't really much you could point to about an afterlife in the Bible. And that's one of the reasons why people claim you have this idea of Sheol, which is maybe an underworld of some kind. I think very similar in other myths like Hades, or just everyone just goes there. But there isn't really much else. The rabbis, on the other hand, have a very different understanding of the afterlife, and it's not a singular understanding. They have multiple points of view, and I just want to share some of these texts and see if that changes our thinking, and also to ask you, like, why do you think the rabbis believe that? So I'm going to share the screen, and we're going to okay. Sorry, yeah. Okay. Can everyone see?
Yes.
Yeah. Great. All right. So I like to have a little bit of Hebrew, just because, we're not going to do everything that we're going to look at in Hebrew, but just want to have a little bit, just because it gets good in Jewish settings. So Va'amar Rabbi Yitzchak, and Rabbi Yitzchak said, Kashe rima lamet kimachat babasar hachai, that worms are as painful to the dead as a needle in the flesh of the living. As it says, and this is from the book of Job, but his flesh is in pain for him. Okay. I'm going to stop sharing just for a moment. Why do you think somebody would believe that? I mean, today I think most people would say, we have enough understanding of the brain to say, like, there's not enough function that, like, you're going to say that when you bury somebody, they can feel the decay of the body, and that they can feel that. Why would somebody believe that? Where would you think that? Recognizing this is pre-scientific, so not expecting them to be having done experiments or anything. Any thoughts?
Are you asking why would they have believed that?
Yeah, I want to ask why. Like, on the one, first, they're definitely coming. They definitely have a verse, but where do you think that? What would be the impetus? I don't think people believe things just from nothing.
Yes.
I can tell a story that might help explain my question. When my daughter was 4 years old, she saw me. I don't always eat steak, but she saw me. I had gotten a steak, and I was sitting there and eating it. And she came to me, she's like, wait, is that from a cow? And I said, yeah. And she's like, and you're gonna eat it? I said, yeah. And I took my fork and I put it in. She's like, wait. And I started cutting it. I'm like, what's going on? She's like, stop, you're hurting it. So she's 16 now, and hopefully, she'll be up here this weekend for winter walk. So, you can remind her of this if you want to embarrass her. But I was so, yeah,
Does she
and
still believe that?
she doesn't still believe it, but it was very cute at the time. And she was really
Right.
upset. She really didn't she thought I was hurting the cow by cutting into the flesh. And I had to explain to her, I'm like, well, the cow doesn't feel it anymore because the brain doesn't function anymore. Right. And the nerves aren't connected, cow can't feel it. But she did believe that. And then the other thing I think of is when people lose limbs that that they'll often talk about still having sensation and without having an understanding of the nervous system the way we do now, you can imagine that maybe that they might have had a different it would have been obvious perhaps even that there might be some pain involved, because how else do you explain why we can feel limbs that are severed? So